that here.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that and explain some of the rationale behind that. So yeah, like I said, Todd's more familiar with the parks, so he's cataloged them in some of these categories. There are different types of park. You keep in mind that different parks have different purposes and different intentions, right? And so some are meant to serve the community broadly at large, and you have the types of facilities that draw people from a larger distance. Some are more focused on the neighborhood and drawing primarily people from nearby, and then some are very, tucked in places. They might have really a special just opportunity or special use. Okay?
So these are just some representative photos of the different things you have. Playgrounds are definitely a backbone within your system, but you have some diversity, some natural areas, skate parks, other types of amenities that make up community parks. Neighborhood level are really a lot of hot lots and playgrounds, and then you have mini parks, which really just service a very small area of a subdivision or a certain geographic area that really are just basic play structures.
So in this process, it starts with identifying, first off, where all the sites are. So each site, as shown in this map, is identified in the Geographic Information System database. It's mapped. We've overlaid on this aerial photograph so we can see what's in it and what's around it. And then those yellow dots, there are things, we call them components, in the park that Todd identified and they got mapped. And so we have a specific location in the GIS for those. They're geocoded as to their more or less exact location. And we'll use that later on in the analysis to determine how they serve the community. But this, for example, in Electric Park here, I see it looks like 4 major components in there. Do you know what those are? I can't read it from
Yeah,
here.
so everyone's pretty familiar with this space. So we have water access right here on the river. We have a nice two-tier structure for the shelter. We have some loop walks in terms of being able to get from certain points, and then a lot of open space, landscape, turf area. So that's really the 4 basic components within that park.
Okay, and that's an example of how we've taken each site and broken it down into its component parts. So we've identified what things are there. And I define components as something you would go to that park to use, something you would have a purpose to go there. You might go there to enjoy the water access. You might go there to take a walk on the trail. You might go there, to use the shelter. We also look at what we call the basically modifiers, which are comfort and convenience features that enhance or affect your use of those. And that would be things like drinking fountains, benches and seats and shade and those kinds of things. So we're really looking at these sites in 2 ways. The actual components of use, and then the support amenities that affect your enjoyment and your ability to use those. Okay. And then we've collected in a data set. This is all in the computer now, and it comes out, can be printed out in these reports that has essentially a score for each location. And each of the items in there, each component is given a functional score, and that score is really based on how well that component, whether it's a playground, tennis court, or even a grassy field, how well that component meets its intended purpose at that location. So therefore, we wouldn't necessarily, if we're looking at a baseball diamond, for example, rate all baseball diamonds, according to a tournament play facility. If it's really intended to just be a pickup game field, we'll score and rate it according to that purpose, that function. So each of them is, everything out there has gotten a score, and then we can add them up, and so there are now numerical values assigned to each place and each thing that's in each place. This is just an example. It's actually
I'm sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
What's the range of scores?
1, 2, 3. So yeah, and I'm sorry, that's great. And please do ask those kind of questions as I go. So for example, a 2 is 90% or more of things out there will score a 2. A 2 means it meets its intended function or purpose at that location adequately now and for the near future over the term of this plan. And really, I've looked at thousands of parks around the country, probably cataloged tens of thousands of components, and most of those are scored a 2. And the reason is parks and recreation agencies, that's what they do, right? They take care of things, they keep things, they meet expectations, that's their job, and they do it pretty well across the country. So then what we're cataloging is things that score a 1 are things that they're either dysfunctional because maybe they're outdated, maybe they're ready for replacement, maybe the need has changed, they may be in good shape, but perhaps they're too small now for the intended use. Or sometimes standards change, so they may be obsolete in terms of the current standards, even though they're in great condition. So those are the way those scores work. It's
Is there
not
a
a condition.
discussion about the scores, like a justification for a number 2 versus a 3?
It's based essentially on our expert opinion, I'll call it that, but it's based also on how we relate that back to what we see in the community. I'll give you a good example of that. If you've been to Washington D.C., to the National Mall, you might not really realize it, but there are probably about 30 or 40 baseball fields or softball fields, official softball fields in terms of being programmed on the National Mall. If you go out there this time of year, you see people playing softball this time of day. And those are just basically grass, and sometimes the grass isn't even in that great of shape. In other communities, they would never count those as softball fields. So it's based on what the norms are in the community, I'll call it that way. Once we go around and we have an ability to, once we've had a chance to see what the norms are, kind of what the range of conditions are, then we can base it on the norms. So it's based on community norms, and it's not necessarily based on a national standard.
I just had a follow-up question on that. What I think Larry was trying to get at is how many coders were there? Was it just one?
Yeah.
Okay.
2, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So it's
Me
not,
and Matt.
so it's just subjective in the 1, 2, 3.
Well, I'll give you an example.
But there's
So,
more than one person doing
Yeah.
the coding, right?
Yeah.
Going back to sort of how we rank them, for example, I think we might have been a little more critical than maybe some.
Yeah.
But, if you've been out to Electric Park, the canoe launch is in kind of bad shape. It's really just a ditch that's been cut into the river, for lack of a better standard. So that got a 1, which means it's pretty bad. Whereas some of them were sort of 3, which is excellent, 2 is sort of average. So you can see that on an overall design and ambience scale, it got a 3. Because it has a lot of nice features in terms of the location, the amenities, people using it, and it just feels like a nice park. We actually noted that, one of the nicest parks in the district. But the one thing that we did pull out and criticize was the canoe launch. So basically, with our expertise and with some guidance from Robbie's firm, we went out and we looked at every single component and really gave it what we felt was a very realistic value in terms of what we thought it was worth.
And as part of my PhD work, I'm actually currently doing validity and reliability test on the instrument. And it's actually, it plays very well in that. So I haven't finished all the statistical analysis on that, but that's my initial data shows good correlation. So the other thing is also, I'll say this, like I said, most things are going to score a 2 because we're really looking for things that are obvious and anomalous, the things that stand out. This is, though, to show you how the modifiers work. This is a made-up photo in Photoshop, but I was going to say, I think the background picture is somewhere in Colorado. The play equipment can be from anywhere. It's probably from a catalog, but it's brand new in that case. So the idea is to show you that this could be a very nice piece of equipment. It could be brand new, it could be beautiful, and that play equipment itself might score a 2 or a 3 in this scoring. But the context plays a role. So if you put it in the next slide, we put it in the same play structure in a much nicer place. And here, we have the play equipment gets the same score. It would still get the same score. But we have, drinking fountains, we have restrooms, we have shade, we have seating, we have all these other things that come into play. So when we run our analysis, that playground has a higher service value, I'll call it, because it's enhanced by these other things around it. So that's kind of how this whole system works.
So we all agree that this probably meets basic needs, and this really creates more of an atmosphere.
Well, the main thing to take away from it is, yeah, you can take a lot of really nice things and put them in the park, but it's also how the park setting and the things that support it. Is there shade? Are there nice trees? Is drinking fountain available?
What about more people?
Yeah, well, they're there because it's a much nicer place.
Not there? I'm saying, well, what about more people?
Oh, yeah, that can be a positive or a negative, yeah. But we'll talk a little bit later how you can use that to your advantage to enhance levels of service. So this is really kind of how the whole thing works. We take those scores, we really run them through a formula. So each component gets its score. then we use those modifiers, the shade, the drinking fountains, and things like that, to in effect be a multiplier for each component. So if there are really nice modifiers, the component will bump up to a higher score. And then we do that on a whole site basis. The modifiers work for one whole site, but each component in that site gets modified. We take those and we come out with this total score for the park is 79.2 in this case, after you've taken everything that's in the park, modified it by its modifiers, and then add it all up. So we have some numbers now that we can sort of score each place on. And once we've done that, the next thing we look at, okay, in this case, let's just say that City Park got the score. And we're going to show you how we apply that to the neighborhood level service. That park here is, in this case, sitting in a grid with a railroad running nearby in some hypothetical location. Go ahead to the next slide. So first thing we do is take that and we in the computer, we call it a buffer. It's a service area. And in this case, we're going to go out 1 mile and say, okay, that park, in this case, we're looking at the service value of that park out to this 1 mile access range, which is really a typical, it's arbitrary, but it's typical. It's based on what a lot of precedent is utilizing. And we go ahead and apply that score to it. Can you go back for just a second?
Yes.
So that buffer is the boundaries of the park site, put out, 1 mile in this case, and it gets a score. Now, in this case, anything that is a park will get a basic score of 2 on this first step. Because we call it green for being green on the map. There's a certain value for it's there, it's available, regardless of how good or bad it is. It has some role. Okay, go ahead. But then we start adding the components. So in this case, we add in a playground, a picnic shelter, and some open turf. And each of those items in this hypothetical situation gets a score of 2. And so each of those dots, those yellow dots, gets this 1 mile buffer around it. And then go ahead. They start to add up. And so that's really what it is. Is anybody familiar with some of these things like walk score or, these different, they call them heat maps, and you go in and they do a similar thing. It's a way of geographically locating amenities and then showing how they influence a service zone around them. So that's what's happening here in these where the shades are darker, it means that there's more things piled up on top, more service buffers with higher scores piled up on each other. So you can see the lighter shades, in this case, towards the outside, there's a score of 2. As you get where all the buffers are overlapping, we now have a score of 8 because we have the score of 2 for the park and 2 for each of the 3 components. Go ahead. So this just explains it a little further. The darker shades reflect higher scores, and there is a numerical value for those in the computer. And then lower scores are reflected in the lighter tones. Now, go ahead to the next slide. However, when we look at some of this, we also look at walkability, and we add a premium in there, things that are within a 1/3 mile distance, which is correlates to an approximately 10-minute walk along indirect routes. When we're looking at the walkability aspect, we start cutting these buffers off for barriers. Railroad track is a barrier, the main street being a barrier. So we've gone back in the computer and we've cut those off. So now when we look at that, once we've done that operation, we see it becomes a little more subtle, a little more precise in there as to where these scores are falling in this hypothetical neighborhood. You can see there's a broader range of scores because of the buffers and because of the premium added in for the walkability. And then if we start looking at multiple sites, their buffers begin to overlap. So we now have a much more complex picture of a community that takes all these things all the factors we've talked about into account. Take where the parks are, what's in them, and where the service buffers align with the geography in terms of barriers and those kinds of things. Voila, boom, go back to the next slide. We take a look now at what the outcome is. When you overlay these on your community.
I got a question for you.
Yeah.
How do you take account for trends? How do you show that? You're working off an average park, grass, maybe a little shelter, water fountain. Okay. And then you're working off the population and you're getting your scores.
Yeah.
What about looking at the drive of the community? what their interests are.
That falls more in Todd's court and in Green Clay's court, because this is one tool on its dashboard, this is one dial on the dashboard.
Right.
Another dial on the dashboard are the results of the survey, or the results of focus groups, or the results of other analyses that are done. So this is just one tool, and this is a snapshot of, this is what it looks like right now. And we can talk a little more later. In fact, we will.
Well, I'm looking at this aspect in regards to where you're at and around the world. I'm saying you get the same answers no matter where you're at, based on the same population. You know, and geographic, because you got standard grass, you got standard, that's what you stemming from, right? At this beginning?
Well, but there's two things working. One is that each of those components as scored don't always equal the same in terms of the parks, and that's what we're getting to. In terms of the premium you put on the different aspects of how it's rated.
Yeah.
The next step of the question is if there's a need to replace something, that really falls into more of the understanding that the level of service sets one picture, the survey, the site, and the other attributes as far as the trends and understanding what would be put into it is a different set of an equation, which will be the next one.
And we're going to talk about that later when we talk about playgrounds. We can
Correct.
tie this back to that.
No, I'm still not catching in regards to how you're trending, your park design, scoring and so forth.
There is no matrix for the trending. It's just taking and understanding what you have
Today.
and understanding what it means in terms of the geographic distribution within your community. It's just a very more scientific way of looking at it, a very old way of doing it in terms of where the parks are and does the community have access to a neighborhood park, to a community park, to walkability. That's all this really is going to demonstrate. So the next step is to take all this analysis and then make some concrete decisions on moving forward.
And these are good questions to bring up later when we talk specifically about playgrounds. We'll try to tie that one aspect of parks back to those questions, and maybe that'll help explain.
Because we do have one example that we can show you in terms of how you would remove one element and then trend in something different to replace it.
Yeah.
Because we're looking at basically setting up oasis based on the land we have in regards to tractability. I'm just trying to figure out the scoring process that you have at this beginning stage. What's the differ between basically anywhere around the world for a park in regards to if you have the same amount of population, density and so forth. So
I think
Hold that thought because we're going to get to that because
yeah, I think we'll hope if I don't answer them later on, ask it.
No problem.
Please do.
Sorry.
Please do. But I want to point out that, so what happens is, because this is not taking population into account at all yet. We will, okay? But for now, this has nothing to do with population. This has simply to do with what's located out there in the parks and where they are. And it shows that around these parks, you have a higher levels of service. It's lighter and lower levels of service in these perimeter areas, or farther away from your main park features. They have more things in them. So it's as simple as that. The more parks and the more things in them, the higher these values are going to be. And so that's just a snapshot of what it looks like today. We can talk later on about how this picture maybe should change in the future. So the trend might be, if you have a lot of growth going on over here on the west side of this community, you probably want to see more shade coming in here, right? Because that's where the people are going. And that's what we want to look at and say, well, these are where the growth trends are, but right now the level of service is higher over here and here. How are we going to address these growing areas in the future? Because these do need to get darker if more people are going to be there, right?
I just have a question too. This is more of the quantitative part of the analysis, and then the qualitative part would be like what you said, when you kind of take population into account. And okay.
That is really true. We're not dealing with population yet. This is simply what's on the ground and how can we assign value to that, and how can we measure where it is. Look at it in a relationship across the entire geography. Okay. But then we go back and we want to say, well, those numbers are just numbers. I think part of your question is, well, how do you know what it should be? What shade is right? What shade should it be?
Well, my point is, setting up for instance, like for let's say apple and orange. So the apple's this, orange is Dan. And that's why I'm trying to figure out your scoring rating and so forth on, okay, let's make it a standard park. You tell me what's a perfect standard, a perfect 3. What do you, expecting a perfect 3, a perfect 2, a perfect 1, what do you look for? That's why we're trying to grasp hold of what you guys are working with these numbers.
Right now, we're looking at, as she said, the quantitative piece. How much is there? Whether or not it's the right stuff is kind of.
Well, we just don't know, what do you consider what the right stuff is? We gotta start from us, like I said, what do you consider is the perfect park? As number 3
There
is
isn't
with the
one.
high score versus what's not a perfect
Yeah.
park.
We don't have a perfect park, but we do have a typical park, and that's what this is right here. So we've looked and said, well, here's a typical park in your community, Commons Park, and it has a playground, a shelter, open turf, and some other amenities. We can look at the score for this and say, okay, there's nothing empirically right or wrong about this park, but it's a typical one, and we can compare your service throughout your community to service around this typical park. So we've calculated the value of this typical park and used it, if we assign it as a threshold, and look in the computer and say, well, where is service in your community above or below the score equal to that park? And it shows, actually, it's pretty good. It shows that all that purple says in your community, everybody in the purple area has access or is served by a score or value that meets that threshold or above. The yellow around the perimeter there are areas that fall below that. The gray, are darker gray there, are areas where there is nothing under this model serving those areas. So what that's telling us is that quantitatively, again, not qualitatively, but quantitatively, you have enough stuff to everyone has access to something that's at or above the typical Commons Park threshold, except in these yellow areas. So we can look at those and say, well, okay, some of these areas, we look at the underlying geography and say, well, it looks like there's a lot of people living over here, potentially. What can we do to enhance service in this yellow area? Same thing down here, same thing here. These might become focus areas up on a closer look to say, how do we turn yellow to purple? And we can do it a couple different ways that we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay? But in summary, what we've seen from this analysis is that you have a good distribution of parks and facilities throughout. Everything's not concentrated in just one place. You've got a nice spread there. There are pockets of higher service around those 2 or 3 more developed parks, but 95% has at least access to something in your community, and that's a good indicator. That looks pretty good. But we can drill down a little bit. Go ahead. Come up with the numbers here and say, and this just shows what I just told you in a little different way, that also of that 95%, that has coverage, actually 83% of your community meets this threshold of access to the value equal to the Commons Park. Only 5% is none at all, and just 12% is below this threshold. So that's good. It's actually a very, and one thing I should explain that doesn't take into account is we did not catalog parks. There might be some parks over here or other facilities from another provider outside of our study area that may actually be providing some service. So that may be worth another closer look before you decide exactly what to do here. I mentioned earlier that we look at what are barriers for walkability, because we score walkability in this equation. And so these red lines here are all of the barriers that were identified by your community, by your staff, as, hey, we want to take these into account as being something that will affect the ability to get to these places. So we've done that. We've affected the walkable service by all of these barriers, which is actually quite, these are more barriers than most communities identify. You've taken a very, I'll call it conservative look at this, which means you're challenging yourself, I think, by doing this. And so we're going to show you the outcome of that. When we do that, now that shaded map looks a lot different. These are only walkable distances around these sites. And now you see when we begin to look at purely from a walking standpoint, after we account for all those multiple barriers that were identified, now we see that we actually got a much different picture here. So the other maps we've looked at included, a short drive. This is purely walking or biking, but purely within a third of a mile of these sites. Now you can see what it begins to look like, and you see that these concentrations of service really start to show up, and you see bigger gaps. Okay? We look at the threshold and say, okay, let's go back and use that same threshold, and now we can see there's a lot more yellow areas on the map, areas with no service at all. We can begin to discuss how do we improve service from a walkable standpoint to those, how do we increase the amount of coverage on this map, and where should that be? And where do we look at enhancing, turning yellow to purple? And then when we break that down, we see that on coverage, on just land area, that 22% of your community has this walkable access, 25% is walkable, but it's below that threshold score, and then 53% has no service by geography. If we look at more by where the people currently live and look at it by population, we see it actually looks a little better. Really, only 36% of the population in the community is beyond that 1/3 mile access distance to the park or facility. And then 34% are actually within the threshold distance and 30% below that threshold. But the thing to keep in mind is those yellow areas, that 30% has access to something. And that may be opportunity areas where we can look at how to improve levels of service in the things that they have access to. Oh, back up one quick. I also want to say this is not unusual. So if we did this for all the other suburbs in the region, it's probably going to look a lot the same. I mean, this is normal. Why? Because our communities were built out in the era of the automobile. And it's a more recent phenomenon that people are really wanting to walk to parks. It's just a more recent thing that's become a higher priority in people's lives. So park systems really developed in the last 50 years, 60 years with a drive-to model. And now we're kind of going back in and saying, how do we retrofit these and increase walkable access to facilities? So your map isn't that different than what a lot of other communities would look like, and perhaps better in a lot of ways. Partly better in the sense that yours looks like a lot of other communities, but you constrained us more by giving us a lot more barriers. A lot of others would have said, oh, they can walk across that street, we're not going to worry about it, call it a barrier. You plugged in a lot of barriers. And so this is a more strict look at your community.
So the barriers, for example, is like a mile per hour street limit, and we used 25.
Yeah, which is really, it's conservative. And I think it's a good thing. I think it's great that you're doing that. But it's more strict than a lot of communities are willing to go to, partly because they say, well, maybe they don't want, maybe they're afraid to face reality. I mean, it could be a lot of different things. But this is a great picture right here. It really tells us that we can identify some opportunities. Okay, and that's basically what I just said, is that although it does show that, where things is near population centers, it doesn't account for growth. We need to start thinking about that, where population is going to be. And like I said, it may be better than what's reflected here because of this, basically. Oh, and the other thing is we don't have trails on here. Yeah, I'm glad we put that on there so I remember. If we took trails into account, that analysis did not take the trails into account. When we get down to it, trails can serve almost an equal value to a neighborhood park because they do provide a variety of activities. People of all ages can use trails, and they get a variety of activities, whether it's basically walking or biking or whatever. In my mind, they serve a very broad constituency. So if we plugged the trails in there, that would probably actually change this map a bit too. Okay. But as we look at it then on walkability and compare the sub areas, what we see is that the lowest percent of of area that has some service, that has access, proximity is a better word, to parks, is in the northeast, as is the lowest average service value across its area. And it has the higher percent of area with no service at all, and the highest percent of area below threshold. So this is just pointing out that the northeast is an area that deserves some more love. Is where can we begin to make